there are major challenges when it comes to financing the agricultural sector, and these are nothing new to us. But it is a cause of great frustration to many of us who've worked in Africa's agricultural sector for years, that this transformation we've been waiting for so many years simply hasn't occurred. So what exactly is the problem? Well, let's look at a typical agri-value chain. This is a cotton value chain from a report by BMA. You can see that there are many different players involved getting the cotton ultimately to turn into clothing that we wear. We have the farmer at the start receiving inputs, seed, fertilizers, producing the raw cotton. That goes to the cotton producer. Of course, that might be a cooperative or a producer organization. They give it to the ginner who gins the cotton. They get the offtake from that. They then give that to a trader, trading house in the middle. The trading house might ship it. It might send it to a spinner or a weaver and eventually sells to a retailer, and that eventually goes to a consumer. And you can see at the bottom, there is a bank involved as well. Multiple payments are involved, many exchanges of documentation, and a huge amount of risk and a huge amount of trust that there needs to be for this system to operate properly. An ideal commodity value chain looks a bit like this. At the bottom, we have the banks and other actors providing financing for inputs. Producers, farmers produce the raw commodities. These go on to the processors and the manufacturers who put them through the asset conversion cycle and turn them into goods. And ultimately, they go to the retailers and exporters and to the consumers. But the reality is very different. And the truth is that financing this value chain is very poorly coordinated, and the lion's share of the resources end up at the end. I think these three charts really demonstrate just how serious the problem is for Africa's agricultural sector. If you look at the one on the left there, the World Bank estimates around 55% of Africa's workforce works in the agricultural sector, but the sector itself gets less than 1% of bank lending. That's the pie chart in the middle. You can see there's a huge mismatch here. And seen from the perspective of the smallholder, the shortfall is enormous. According to the IFC, the total amount of debt financing available to smallholder farmers in the developing world is $9 billion. That's less than 3% of their financing demand. So why is it that financing is so poorly pushed into the agricultural sector, particularly where it's needed? Well, it really comes down to the balance between risk and available finance. Let's take a typical value chain here, which goes in one direction, let's say for the production of maize and meal in Southern Africa. We have the farmers at the beginning of the chain, they harvest the maize, they process it basically. It then goes into the middle of the chain, it might go to a grinder or a miller, it passes through warehouses, traders, might be a warehouse in the country of origin, and then a warehouse in the consuming country. And at the end of it, you finally have your revenue, the end of the value chain. As we pass through this value chain, there are numerous risks. At the beginning, we have country risk, of course. You could have problems, instability in a country, or maybe natural disasters which disrupt production. You have crop risk, which is, let's say, it might be a weather event, it could be disease or pests. And of course, producer risk. Is the farmer actually going to produce the crop? This in some ways is the same as performance risk, if you like. As we go to the middle of the chain, we have quality risk. Are people properly seeing that the maize is properly stored? Is there infestation? Is there damage? Too much humidity? Logistics risk, is it possible to get from A to B? And of course, warehousing risk. Huge amounts of fraud occur in warehouses as well. Is it being properly managed and looked after the product? And then at the end of the value chain, you of course have credit risk. Are you going to be repaid at the end? It means that there are a huge amount of risks in the value chain, and they effectively diminish as you go through the chain. And as you get to the end of it, they are practically almost zero. This means that conversely, the amount of financing available goes in the opposite direction. So this means if you're at the left side of the value chain, you're a farmer at the beginning, probably you cannot get direct financing from banks. If you are somewhere between the middle of the value chain, let's say you are a processor, you might be able to get 20, 30% of the value of what you're processing because you're still a long way from the market. If you have, let's say, goods in a warehouse up country, maybe 50% because you still need to get them to the coast. Let's say if you've got graded and quality check bags in a bonded warehouse at a port, maybe 80%. And ultimately, if you have a lot which is on a ship and it's going to an international port, a bank may even finance you 100%. confident that any trader would be able to make the margin back on his sale. But what this means is the vast majority of financing is available at the end of the value chain. We've seen it with the big trading houses who get the billions of dollars of financing from banks. They trickle some of this back to the suppliers and the processors in the middle. But at the beginning of the value chain, it means that really almost nothing is available. There's self-financing, there's small amounts of money from development organizations, there's some funding, let's say, from cooperatives, but it is not nearly enough, and that is where it is really needed. The impact this has is appalling. And we can see this by the low use of inputs in Africa and the very low yields. First off, if you imagine the critically low use of fertilizers. According to the FAO, in 2019, Africa used around 7 million tons of fertilizer. That's only 6% of the amount used in Asia and around 13% of that used in the Americas. And this means that actually crop yields are among the lowest in the world in Africa. Southern Africa itself, you can see in the table on the left, it is the continent's breadbasket. Countries such as South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi often export their maize surplus around the region, and they have yields similar to Europe and Asia. But if we look at somewhere like West Africa, it has average yields of about 1.3 tons per hectare. That's only 1/4 of the yields in the Americas. So there's a very serious impact here that the lack of ability to finance creates in the sector. And of course, it means at the same time that it's not possible for farmers to produce more crops in order to get more financing. The impact that this has on food production is very serious. And we've seen Africa's food import dependency rising strongly in recent years. According to Intrasyn, imports of staple foods, these are wheat, rice, and palm oil, have quadrupled over the past 20 years. They peaked at over $26 billion in 2011. They're currently around $23, $24 billion. Among the leading importers, we have countries like Cote d'Ivoire, $600 million of rice last year, Nigeria, $1.3 billion of wheat and $600 million of rice, and Kenya with over $500 million as well. So there's, and a lot of these numbers don't really tell the whole story. According to official statistics, something like $500 million worth of rice is imported into Benin every year, but it's not consumed by the population. Most of that rice is parboiled rice, which is actually destined for Nigeria, and most of it is smuggled across, which means there's a lot of lost revenue, and local suppliers are constantly undercut by illegal cheap imports. And the problem is that local production just cannot keep up with demand. We have a rising urban population. We generally have a rising population. The demand is rising and the food shortfall is there. We need to have new ways of ensuring we can have local production of food crops. And then the final point also is, how do we actually identify the farmers? One of the most absurd things about the value chain for agriculture in Africa is that very few people know who anyone is who is producing these crops. There are so many middlemen in there who deliberately keep the information from us about where these crops come from. So anyone who is buying a product in a Western market has no idea who the farmer is. And if the farmer is essentially invisible, how do you lend to the farmer? How do you support them? How do you take risk on them? It's essential to connect them in so we can support, whether it's a cotton farmer, a rice farm, a tea farmer, they need to be visible. And to do that, you need to connect them digitally. All of these problems come together. The inability to get the finance to them, the inability to judge risk, and this terrible food import dependency. They're all linked. And what is needed is a new paradigm to shift that. And that is what digital agriculture is.